In a time of rising unrest, when borders dominate headlines and immigration policy shapes the future of our nation, the truth matters. From the front lines of law enforcement, national security, and public policy, this is Frontline Facts, where rhetoric is stripped away, where politics takes a back seat, and where facts, hard, documented facts, lead the conversation. As instability grows beyond our southern border, as communities feel the impact at home, we bring you informed voices. Attorneys, senior law enforcement leaders, policy experts, and professionals who understand the law, the protocols, and the consequences. This isn't opinion. This isn't spin. This is clarity in a time of confusion. This is Frontline Facts, and the conversation starts now.
Welcome to Frontline Facts with Luisa Deason, where we correct the rhetoric on immigration issues and public policy. In today's episode, we will dive into what has happened into the past 10 years and why the cartels now have so much power. We will include the threats to both Mexico and the U.S. in the next 60 minutes. Our special guest, Arturo Fontes, is a former expert with the FBI and has worked in combating the cartel activity in Mexico and around the world. I want him to help us describe what is happening in Mexico today with the cartels and what are the ties to terrorist cells. Arturo, welcome to Frontline Facts. How are you?
I'm doing great, Luisa. Thanks for having me.
Listen, you and I have had several conversations and you gave me a great interview that kind of posed some follow-up questions last week. And one of the things that I have been doing is finding out what is the nexus that lies between Mexico and the U.S. and the terror cells that are here and there. One of the proposed questions I asked you was, is it not a red flag to have a large Iranian consulate in Mexico when in fact they don't really do much to protect their southern border? Explain a little bit of that concern to our listening public today.
Okay, just to put things in context and talking about the Iranian embassy and how I became familiar with that was right after 9/11, we uncovered that two of the hijackers, the 9/11 hijackers, lived in a house in San Diego where the handling agent, which I knew personally, his name was Steve Butler, and he's also an open source, and he was a San Diego case agent, where two of the hijackers lived in San Diego, and they were there for at least 18 months in San Diego, and after that, almost every FBI agent, directly or indirectly, was assigned to work terrorism, counterterrorism. And then the Patriot Act came into existence. But since I was on the border, and most people, were familiar with the Middle East, at least who have worked it and knew a lot about terrorism, I knew as much terrorism just from hearing the news and what happened in 9/11, and everybody was just engulfed in that area. And so I focused my attention to Latin America. And as you know, and I'm bringing back history, so then I'll bring it back to the Iranian embassy. We also looked at, like, in 1992 and 94 in Argentina, there was an incident at the Israeli embassy and also at the Jewish Cultural Center in Argentina, where 29 people died in the embassy and 85 people, Jewish people, died at the Cultural Center. And we learned about the tri-border region where Hezbollah had a presence there. And we also knew, about a lot of the smuggling activities that came in, to Central America, into Mexico, Chiapas, and Mexico. So we really took a deep dive into that whole area because I thought that the biggest threat was Latin America because it was so close to the U.S. And we also came across scenarios where if the terrorists cannot come into, let's say, the U.S., a soft target would be Mexico. And we always looked at Mexico because imagine back in World War II, the Nazis had a presence there. And then during the Soviet era, the Russians and the Cubans had a presence there. where Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, a lot of the people had a presence in Mexico. So we knew that terrorism was alive and well in Mexico. At least it was an area where they could use it as a base, because by debilitating Mexico, I mean, by debilitating the U.S., Mexico was a staging point for many of these groups. And we learned also that at that time, during 9/11, we also looked at the area of Chiapas, which was a very vulnerable area for terrorism. For example, we learned that the Iranian embassy was funding a makeshift mosque, most likely in Chiapas, in Torreon, Coahuila, Mexico. And we knew that the routes were from Chiapas all the way down to Torreon, and then crossing to the port of Miguel Alemán into the U.S. For some reason, those areas are very porous areas where they feel comfortable, and they were able to cross it. And the Gulf Cartel actually was able to cross them.
And these are cartels, so there is involvement with the cartels and with these terrorist cells.
Yes, let me go back again now. I learned that now this is, I know that I'm deeping in a little bit, but I just knew that at that time when 9/11 happened, after it happened, I knew that that the cartels and these terrorist organizations, especially Al Qaeda, Hezbollah, and a lot of these groups, and they had to have funding, and that funding came from drug trafficking, mostly heroin that came from Afghanistan. When I brought that idea up to our heads in Washington, nobody wanted to hear the word narco-terrorism. They did not want to hear it. But we brought evidence that the Afghans were working with the cartels and to bring in their drugs into the US. And also they also provided weapons to the Mexican cartels. At the same time, in 2003, 2004, we came across a source that was a spiritual advisor for the Zetas. And this spiritual advisor turned us into turned you know provided turned us in as a source, where he introduced a a Middle Eastern person named Talal Hassan Gantus. And this person, along with some subsources, actually went to Lebanon, Hezbollah, and it's well documented where there was weapons that were being planned to move into Mexico to supply the Zetas, so that they could fight their wars with the Sinaloa cartel. And that same person, Talal Hassan Cantus, was arrested in Belize and then taken. It was a case that I worked jointly with DEA, and he was arrested and then taken into U.S. custody later. And he
Well, this
was
is pretty scary happening right after 9/11.
yes, and at the same time period we were collecting this information, we also learned that the Belizean government would provide passports or even visas. And once they got the passports, these Middle Easterners, they were able to come into Mexico without even being smuggled. And a lot of these people were able to cross into the U.S. either illegally and sometimes legally. Now, what's interesting is that, keep in mind that in the 1990s, you had the Zapatista movement, and many of these cartels wanted weapons and training. And during these wars in 2004, 2000, 2003, we started seeing IEDs, and we started seeing bombs. And we also learned that there was training where many of these Middle Easterners, including the FARC, would be training Mexican cartel members, because we were not seeing a lot of the violence like we did before. We would be seeing beheadings. We would be seeing the violence just increase so much. And these ideas, I believe, came from terrorists that would train some of these cartels.
That's incredibly scary. That's incredibly scary. Now, let me ask you this. So, from your experience in working with and combating cartel activity, what is the biggest threat that we face today? I know that the threat exists in Mexico, but having worked of immigration, I know that, the caravans are organized by the cartels to bringing illegal immigrants, illegal aliens, and of course, they're not coming in with the best of the best. Mexico needs to seal their southern border, but they have failed to do so miserably for decades. And so, what is the biggest threat Mexico faces that ultimately will end up being a big threat to the United States and the citizens in this country?
Okay. So you have so many years now where you have how many millions of people that came in the last 4 or 5 years? Was it 13 million? I'm not really sure.
I think the
Yeah.
numbers are much, much higher than that. But yes, we
Yeah.
don't even know who the gotaways are, but I know that we've let in excess of 274 terrorists just in the last previous 4 years under the Biden administration. That's historic.
Right. And when President Bush, former President Bush mentioned the axis of evil and the axis of evil, whether it was Russia, China, Venezuela, Cuba, and these other countries, I believe that they were all working together to somewhat debilitize, destabilize the United States with false propaganda, interfering in our elections, bringing the drugs into the United States, and by bringing in so many people, they have an open border to bring in so many people. And like Trump would say, some of these people are not the best people, and they're here to debilitate our country. And it has been, where you have the scandal in Minneapolis where some of the Somalis were taking monies, by fraud, and you have the drugs coming in and the fentanyl coming into our country, and I'm giving you the worst of the worst, but at the same time, there's good people coming in. But unfortunately, how do you distinguish both? So you have to scrutinize almost everybody because of the cost of these bad people doing bad things.
Well,
And
and it's
so,
not necessarily profiling. What it is you're following a pattern of behavior and you're following trends. And in law enforcement, most law enforcement agencies at the federal level communicate very well. And when you don't have cooperation from local and state, then when things start spilling over, it creates a bigger risk.
yes, and so to answer your question, yes. Imagine so many people coming in to the United States, and many of these people were not properly vetted, and we know that, this incident that's happening right now and the war with Iran was already looking at this. And I believe that many of these people that are in the country right now are not favorable to the U.S. and they are our enemies. They don't want us to go forward. And some of these people may be even on the fence, where they're sympathizers for what's going on in Iran, and that's why you're having some of these incidents that are happening. There are sleeper cells, in the United States. Is it? And the question is when? When will they attack? It's not if. It's when will they attack? And I believe that is something that the FBI and all the other agencies. I believe that the red flags are at the highest since 9/11 right now.
Well, I would agree with you there, and I just look back and think about, the problem that we're having with the defunding of the DHS and TSA and all that. I mean, TSA was created for the purpose of screening people through the airports because as a direct result of the 19 hijackers during 9/11. And these people that are not being paid, that are TSA agents kind of at the front lines of the ports of entry, it's ridiculous to think that this government does not want to recognize the risk at hand. But the bigger threat, in my opinion, is we already have cells here. Who are they? And we both know that they're very, very patient. So it's almost as if we've learned nothing after 9/11. What is your spin on that, or where do you see the bigger dangers? We are at a high threat level right now.
There's a lot of soft targets. Just to give you an example, I was at the rodeo this last week in Houston. Where it would have been easy for someone to smuggle a gun inside and create a international incident. It was just so many people there, and I'm just a little wary of just going to public events right now because I'm just afraid that something is going to happen, and that's what they're looking for. And I'm looking at simultaneous attacks in multiple cities. Keep in mind the World Cup is coming up to the U.S. and Mexico and and Canada. those are highlights that I believe that the threat level is even higher. Mexico is not prepared either, for many of these Middle Eastern groups that are also living in Mexico. And you asked me about the Iranian embassy again. I believe that the Iranian embassy is there for propaganda as a spy agency, to interfere with our elections, to facilitate the smuggling of people, to facilitate these groups also to interact with some of these cartels. Anything that has to do with disrupting and destabilizing our country, I believe that that's the reason why that they have a big embassy.
Well, and the problem is that people are not being educated on the actual dangers of what's happening. I mean, we see the media all the time, and it's defund ICE and defund this and defund that, and it's like, this is ridiculous. These are the frontline agencies that work in conjunction with the FBI to combat terrorism. One of the functions under Biden's administration with DHS was Mayorkas was supposed to be investigating domestic terrorism. And instead of the domestic terrorism going after the cells and the people that are already here that have not been properly vetted, they go after parents at town hall meetings for being upset about schools doing ridiculous things like the kinds of books that are being shown in libraries for younger children that are not apt to understanding that. And of course, all the wokeness. But here's my question. And so where do we go from here? So if Mexico is used as a transit to be able to funnel all this kind of illegal immigration along with, bringing in terrorists, what is the bigger threat? Because people need to start waking up. This country needs to actually wake up and realize what's really happening. In your judgment, based on your years of career and experience, what is the bigger threat at the southern border right now? And what happens if this violence spills over to the U.S.?
The Mexican government, just put things in perspective, it has improved, since in the last couple of years with President Sheinbaum. As I talked to you before, Sheinbaum is going through, havoc with their political party. The corruption is at the highest point. Everybody talks about that Mexico was always corrupt. The difference right now is that she destabilized many of the police agencies. Where one, just little details. For example, the political the judges now are being elected by the people. It's not a certain group of scholars that also apply, and the same Department of the justices appoint these people. These people, let's say someone who wants to run for uh, a judge or a Supreme Court judge in Mexico, they are totally reliant on the political or the cartels to fund them. One guy told me that this is a high profile politician, said that the only way that you could become a local, state, or federal politician in Mexico is if you have the support of the cartels. And while Mexico maintains this corruption, that is definitely a big gap for the United States, and it debilitates us because the corruption is what's letting these people come into Mexico and having them come into the U.S. Even though we think that we have a sealed border and things are not coming through, the drugs are still coming across the border. Undocumented people are still coming into the U.S. It just costs more, and the threat is still alive and well. And I agree with you. It's like we're our worst enemies. Our political uh, uh, our political parties are so divisive, and we're not really helping each other. And I think that's a big threat. But Mexico is definitely a big threat. Central America is a big threat. And the worst thing that could happen is that they continue to come across the border, and especially now we're at war with Iran. Iran, believe me, they have their people here. They're these cells, and there's the danger that these people attack. The question is, when will they attack?
Well, and that's the even scarier part. You and I are kind of reading off the same page based on our background, but my concern is what can people do to protect themselves? You tell people, keep your head on a swivel, be aware of your surroundings. I tell people all the time. They ask me where they should travel, and I go, well, really, Mexico is not where you want to travel, and you have to be aware when you're traveling to heed the warnings from the Department of State websites and other things. Anybody who thinks that nothing's going to happen to them is absolutely delusional in today's day and age.
I agree with you, Luisa. Just an example is Mexico. How many people were in Cancun and these operations occurred, and you people being yanked out of their cars and not knowing what to do. The main thing, if you're in a foreign country and this happens, you have to be compliant. Don't be a hero. Do what you're told, and just stay away from the X, like we would say. Stay away from the X. Go to places where you feel safe, whether it's a hotel room, and if you feel that there's danger, just stay in a safe place, and I think that's one suggestion. But yeah, the threat level is at the highest it could be right now. If you can imagine that.
Now, when we talk about these cells and the cooperation with the cartels, I mean, we obviously know that there's a huge fentanyl problem coming into this country, but it's not necessarily, well, you describe it to me. You know the cartels better than I'll ever understand them, but where is the fentanyl coming from and why is it such a big issue? I know that I'm speaking to other law enforcement later on this week, and they're suggesting that a lot of it is now because you clamp down on the southern border, it's now entering the northern border. And describe some of that activity to me.
One of the things that a source actually told me was that it's becoming more difficult to smuggle the drugs from Mexico into the U.S. So many of the fentanyl, at least the precursor, is coming across the Mexican border into the U.S. And now you're starting to see even pill making, pressers, where they're also making the fentanyl pills in the United States, which is a new thing. And now the fentanyl that's coming in, they're just diluting it a little bit more, even though it appears like the cocaine and even the fentanyl, the price is still the same. But what they're doing is that they're watering it down a lot more. The purity is a lot less, so it seems like they're still bringing it, but it's the prices are still the same. They haven't changed that much, but the quality of the drugs coming in is a lot less, and there's also less people dying of overdoses of the fentanyl because of that. And that's why it seems like things. Well, why is it that the price is still the same? Well, don't look at the price. Look at the quality of the drug, and also again, I believe that the cartels, like we talked about last time, it's the cartels. You push the balloon, you squeeze it, and it goes one way, and the cartels always find a way to get the drugs across. They're making money, and they'll always find ways. Whether it's more extortions, more kidnappings, and they're going to find ways to do things better.
Listen, we're going to have to cut over to a commercial break real quick because we do have sponsors we want to highlight. Thank you for waiting.
When the stakes are high, clarity matters. In today's fast-moving media environment, misinformation spreads fast, especially around immigration policy, national security, and public safety. That's where Deason Consulting Services steps in. Led by Luisa Deason, former investigative journalist, DHS and ICE subject matter expert, and certified neuro-linguistic programming practitioner, Deason Consulting equips leaders, candidates, law enforcement, and executives with clear posture, confident delivery, and fact-based messaging. From immigration policy education and media response strategy to crisis communication and executive message development, Deason Consulting helps you cut through the rhetoric and speak with authority. Whether you're preparing for a press conference, navigating a complex policy issue, or facing high-pressure media scrutiny, we prepare you to lead. Deason Consulting Services. Strategic communication, informed leadership, measured response. Contact Deason Consulting today and be ready when it matters most. Call today 832-244-2488 or email Luisa@DeasonConsultingServices.com.
Well, we are back. I am Luisa Deason. I am your host for Frontline Facts. We are correcting the rhetoric, and we're coming back to our guest today. We now return to Frontline Facts with our special guest, Arturo Fontes. Arturo, just during the commercial break, we left off and broke off talking about the level of violence that has increased in Mexico, and let's kind of dive into how all that ties into illegal immigration and document fraud and the types of drugs that are coming in and the types of people that are coming in, specifically those that are gaining benefits that should never be here.
Okay. There's always that saying that goes, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." And that case that I told you about with Talal Hassan Gantus, it was we had a Colombian unwitting, and the spiritual advisor, and also this Lebanese person that had a restaurant in Mexico City. So there was ties between the Colombian cartels, Colombian drug traffickers, the Zetas, and so these people work together. And just like the cartels hire the best guns, because at that time, in 2000, what is it, 2003, the cartels were, whoever was the most ruthless was the most powerful. And at that time, the Zetas were the most ruthless. They hired Caibiles, they hired Middle Easterners to help them with their bombs. They hired ELN and FARC members to help them with their IEDs. And there was, it was surprising to me is that the cartels normally do not want to bring in someone that's that high profile. And if somebody commits a terrorist act, they're going to blame it back to cartels. They're a little bit more careful, but money really is what moves the needle for these cartels. And when they have money, or they feed them with some weapons, or they give them something that they need, they're going to do it. And then we also talked about that. I learned just recently that within the Mexican system, there was approximately 300 passports that were missing, meaning that there was passports that the Mexican government was able to use, where they could put pictures of people that are pictures with some names of legitimate names in Mexico, and use these passports maybe to obtain a U.S. visa, or to be able to cross to different countries. And imagine that, a terrorist with a Mexican passport that looks Latin, maybe even speaks Spanish, and remain undetected.
Well,
And
that's
he's
one thing that I've said all along. I told you the story about 9/11. After that, you're walking into a store and you see somebody who is obviously a Muslim, and not to profile here, but I mean, if you're going to be a radical about it, one of the things that's concerning is they're acclimating and living in Mexico. What's your take on that?
Well, I don't know if I mentioned that though. Is that when I was mentioning in Chiapas, you have about 5,000 Muslims just in Chiapas, and there are different mosques that are in that area, and also parts of Mexico. I know that there was a Muslim group called Morabitun, Murabitun, and it's a community in Chiapas, where several of the indigenous groups actually went to Mecca for their pilgrimage. So these are the indigenous Mexican people from Chiapas actually went to the pilgrimage. They do not look Muslim, but they're of Mexican descent. And so imagine these people, if they are converted and are sympathizers, for the Shia Muslims, or for Hezbollah.
That's incredibly alarming. Incredibly alarming. We know that document fraud is prevalent. You can go to just about any black flea market here and obtain documents to legal permanent residence and all kinds of things. But the bigger question is, what we don't need is for people to gain access to documents that allow them to vote in this country. We don't want that Islamic movement to have access to be able to vote illegally. I mean, there's got to be checks and balances. But my bigger fear is now, with all of this activity going on in Chiapas and in Mexico and in Belize and, all the other things that are happening, tell me, what is the bigger threat, and what can people, are we at risk at today in the United States, especially with the situation with the United States and Iran?
Well, it's not just United States, Iran. You're talking, you're mentioning Iran. You got Russia, that's also in collusion with Iran, and the Chinese, pushing their propaganda along with Iran and Russia. Russia is not our friend, and China I don't believe is our friend. And when we're talking about the threats, it's a lot of it's the propaganda. Our countries cannot get together on one simple law. It's got to be either one or the other, and it's so pervasive. And I think that's a big threat. The threat, as we talked about, is we're looking at the worst. Whether there's different cells at different times or same times committing a terrorist attack, are we ready for that? And
Well, I don't think a lot of people realize that in today's day and age, back in 9/11, when our military went over to fight in Afghanistan and in Iraq, the problem was, the whole basis was to keep the terrorists there and the threat there on their land. Now we have the threat here in our land, and so what's the possibility of having? We're already seeing shooters, active shooters that are naturalized citizens that are starting to. It's almost like they're testing the system. And my biggest fear is that we'll have car bombings and things that we don't see here or have never seen in this country happening very soon if we don't do something to really combat this problem. And the fact that President Trump has now shut off and discontinued visas for many of these countries that either support terrorism or are part of the terrorism problem, I think is epic. You need Marco Rubio is the head of. Thank God he's the head of the Department of State, because you can't just let anybody into this country. We're going to see the worst of the worst if we don't start waking up.
yes, you just mentioned Marco Rubio. I think he's the best thing that ever happened to the U.S. And we talked about it before. Uh, the U.S. has always looked outside of the Western Hemisphere. We always looked at Iran, Africa, the Middle East, and China, and these other countries when we we neglected the Western Hemisphere or Latin America mostly, and China took advantage of that. They have an influence in almost every Latin American country, and you go to Colombia, Mexico, and other countries, and you see the Chinese cars all over the place, and you start seeing a lot of these Chinese companies, but they disguise themselves with Mexican companies here in Mexico, and a lot of their goods are still coming into the U.S. And we just don't have a handle on that. We don't have a handle on a lot of propaganda that's coming in and how much collusion these other countries have with Iran, and what you just mentioned. Could the U.S. have bombings like they had even in Mexico? It's just so close to us. I was in Laredo where we found some grenades in Laredo, Texas. We had incidents that happened on the U.S. side, but it wasn't terrorism. It was all drug trafficking. But if that could happen with the drug cartels, I'm sure that the terrorist groups are going to do something a lot worse.
Well, and you're looking at, for example, the threat. I mean, Mexican nationals can't carry weapons in Mexico. You and I both know that. So not only are the cartels and the terrorist cells better armed than the military, but it's a threat. And Mexico usually doesn't involve themselves in any kind of a conflict or combat type situation because of who they are. But my bigger concern is the world needs to wake up to what's happening. And my assessment is there's always some kind of a distraction or a diversion by these by the deep state, and we have deep dirty money coming into campaigns and other things, and it's just when you start to think about this is a it's been a slow process and a slow brainwash of the American public, but people need to wake up and see that the cartels are working with terror cells, and there's more than one type of terror cell here. Back to the Mark Rubio thing, I think it's incredibly important that people understand. Yes, it may be a disposition or an inconvenience to shut somebody from a terrorist country from coming in and obtaining a visa, but the problem is much larger than that. And you and I both see it from the perspective of the cells are here. We need to continue to identify, apprehend, and remove these people from this country without the concerns of everybody's due process being violated. These are civil cases on immigration and immigration courts, and the FBI has always worked very, very well with ICE. How do you see that moving forward and being able to continue to further clamping down on, if we identify the root sources, making sure that those visas are not awarded to those countries? And of course, the United States should always be at the forefront of protecting U.S. citizens.
I agree, Lisa. I think that's you hit it right on. I believe that Trump has done a pretty decent job at scrutinizing, a lot of these visas, especially from these countries. As you know, the midterms is coming up, and who knows how that's going to go. And we don't know what's going to happen, after 2 years or 3 years when the next administration comes in. Will they be as liberal as Biden, letting so many people in and reverse everything that Trump did? Uh, there's always good things and bad things that different administrations do, but at least with the security that Trump's doing, taking Maduro and Venezuela, uh, the sealing the border in Mexico, scrutinizing more on the people that are coming in. I think has done a pretty good job. Uh, but right now, there's war with Iran. People are losing their patience. And now that we're in, we need to finish it, and we need to be more vigilant now, because the situation is at the level 10. It's at the level when 9/11 happened, or before 9/11. I believe it's that high, and we just need to not leave our guard down, and be more vigilant where people are scrutinized, and if you see something, you report it. If you hear something, you also report it, and just don't let your guard down. And if you go into foreign countries, don't look like a tourist. Don't have a camera on you, looking. You could take a camera and take pictures normally, but just have somebody watching your back.
Well, and that's just it. I'm a Mexican national. I got here legally. And one of the biggest things is, we see family in Mexico and Guadalajara, and we just think, my God, may God protect them all. But one of the things I wanted to bring up, and I know that you probably have the same thought process that I do, but this ridiculousness with these Democrats to uh, the deep state that absolutely are refusing at all cost to support the SAVE Act. I mean, what better way to protect American elections and federal elections? It is a crime to vote. At least that's was my perception with the Immigration Service many, many years ago. That you have to become a citizen to have the authority and the privilege to vote in this country. You have to be a U.S. citizen to obtain a U.S. passport. And what we're seeing here is they just want to fight every tooth and nail and put every obstruction up so that it just makes it easier for these people that are terrorists and that are a threat to this country to be able to vote. And that to me is it's almost treasonous and criminal. It really, truly is.
Yes, Lisa, and it's you ask what are our biggest threats, and those are some of our biggest threats. And you see some states like Minneapolis, and it is um, just unbelievable to see that some of these laws and how they're being done, uh, and they're not letting our law enforcement operate, without being interfered.
Well, something has to change drastically. I think it's education at the local levels and getting out to grassroots and, making sure the other thing is with the cartels and all the other stuff, being in control of illegal immigration is the fact that we have these NGOs that were created and funded by God knows who. You and I probably know who, but, they're the fact that an illegal alien or a criminal illegal alien has a better rights in this country and is tied to cartels and terrorism than the U.S. citizen and the protections awarded to them is just ludicrous to me. It's absurd and it's criminal. Um, we need to change the tide, and we really need to. We're running out of time, in my opinion. Don't and correct me if I'm wrong, but I usually will get a topic and I dissect it, and then I talk to my experts, such as yourself, and then I think, okay, I can't sleep because my mind's going with what should be done. What other suggestions do you have to the American public or to our audience in moving forward? I mean, you've got to be vigilant, stay away from large events with large crowds. What else can they be doing? Report anything you see.
Yeah, you hit it right on, Lisa. A lot of people are scared to travel overseas, especially now, and I understand that. A lot of people are still going to go out to a football game, to a baseball game, and just remember that we're in a situation that is very difficult right now with the war, and there's always a potential that something could happen. I always tell, like, if it's my wife, or it's a female that's walking to her car, or on vacation. A lot of women want to wear high heels. I always tell a lot of women to wear comfortable shoes that you're able to run and get away and be nimble. I think that's important.
Creating that distance, absolutely.
Yes, and the other things about carrying your backpack and those are just issues not to get robbed or burglarized, but we're talking about more for terrorist activities and incidents where somebody wants to come in, you know, and start shooting people. The main thing is just to get down and find a cover, cover where something blocks you from getting hit or concealment to hide, from the shooter. But stay away, from the X. And if you're going to go to these events, just know that there's always that potential. And I always tell people when you go to restaurants or you go to a movie theater, always find out where the exit is, not just the front exit. Look at other ways where you could get out, and always have your back against the wall where you could look at a 180 or and see people come in and come out, and know that if something bad happens, know where the exit is, and just dress comfortably and being able to be nimble and get away. And if you're not able to get away, yes,
And I even add, have a copy of your passport with you if you're traveling. Have a copy of the numbers for the US Embassy wherever you're going. You need to know what your escape routes are. You need to be aware and vigilant about the surroundings. And of course, by all means, the first thing is go to the Department of State and heed the warnings that they're giving. Now, you and I had a conversation earlier and last week, and it was based on the fact that, the targets aren't US citizens. But I mean, you can pose a threat by being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
that's correct.
So I just say you need to be completely aware of your surroundings. Now, is there anything else that we've discussed it and covered quite a bit of territory, but based on your experience in the current environment, is there anything that we've left out that you want to talk about?
I think it's important for people to understand. I know that this. I know that we're looking more into ways of security and safety. Whether it's Democrat or Republican, the situation is real. And don't think about which way is political is right or wrong. Just a situation. You have 13, 14 million people that came in 4 years ago, or a couple within the last 5 years, and a lot of these people are not favorable to our country, and they want to do harm to our country. And this potential for a terrorist attack is real. And don't look at this as political. And we want to be able to just safeguard yourself and support this security, especially now with this war that goes on. Whether it was right or wrong, whether we attacked Iran, it did happen, and the situation is at an all-time high for a potential terrorist attack, whether it's a bombing, whether it's people at the same time in different cities shooting at a location that is public where it's going to get a lot of attention. And so just be vigilant.
Well, I say this too. The scary thing is, I know that Detroit at one point, many years ago after 9/11, what I had discovered was that they had a very large Muslim population. Of course, there's a difference between the Christian Muslim and those that were to the radical left that want to do us harm that are part of the terrorist organizations. But my concern is now Texas leads the nation in the amount of mosques requirements to build mosque and this care group that is doing these inner city type developments and they want Sharia law and all those stuff. These are things that are at our back door. They're happening now. They're having situations in McKinney that are you've got a lot of prayer going on in the streets, and I'm just thinking this is insane. When did we become a nation where we were so open and so opportunistic that we have allowed this to take place with the wrong people that want to do us harm, creating, I'm not saying everybody's bad, but obviously you've seen it firsthand, so you have a different perspective than most people.
Living in San Diego, we've seen a lot. We actually had many cases in San Diego because we had a large Somali and Muslim population in San Diego. I also traveled to New York right after 9/11, so I got to see, a lot of the intel that came out. Uh, Texas, you're right, though. I think it was Dallas. They're building a huge area Muslim community there, and it is not to be not to be racist. I think there's a lot of good Muslim people, but it's just that few people that could do harm to this country. And a lot of times, we always wonder, of getting people in this country that are, following our rules and our way of life and our culture, and sometimes when they're not, We just need to, we want our way of life, and sometimes we just see people that may not be favorable to our culture and to our way of life, and that, to me, that's concerning.
Well, and the bottom line is that when you get to this country and you're seeking the opportunity, you've met every single requirement of that visa and that benefit. You must understand that if you're a foreign national in this country and you come in as a foreign student and you don't comply with those rules on those visa requirements, you are no longer wanted or welcome in this country. You're a visitor. And that's, I think, what a lot of people feel like. They get here and they're entitled to something, like we owe them something. And we don't owe anybody anything. We're a land of opportunity. We have an incredible diversity in this country, but the advantage to being here is that you follow the rules and you acclimate to the system and the way of life here, and to feel somewhat rewarded, or that the system owes you something. I'll give you an example. Those that don't want to acclimate to the system and think that they can are entitled to just the way of life they left. A good example is people seeking asylum, Arturo. And
Yes.
when you're seeking asylum, you're fearing you're normally fearing political or religious persecution of the life that you left in the country you left. Now, coming here and then acting the same way, or wanting to go back because someone's getting married, and I use this example. I have Venezuelans, sometimes it'll ask me if they can go back. They're under an asylum claim, and they want to go back for a wedding. And I just think, did you just hear yourself? Are you listening to what you're asking the government to do? You want to go back for something in a country where you're fleeing. I mean, how big is the fear of persecution if you're going to go back for a wedding? People have just lost the perspective. There are certain countries where people are fleeing for real reasons. And to take advantage of that, or the benefits that the U.S. awards you, I think there just need to be a more stringent process to vetting everybody carefully.
That's correct. And you could see, President Roosevelt, but that was back in the days when, he was fierce opponent of divided loyalty. He famously stated that there's no room in this country for hyphenated Americanism, meaning one should be either German American, Irish American, but simply an American. And those are terms that he used in the past. And a lot of it is, our country is whether it's the loyalty to this country. If the thing hit the fan, are you going to support this country?
Well, let's see what happens with that.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else that you want to add before we close? Because
No, I think we're good.
show.
So I think we're good. Thank you.
Well, listen, I want to thank you again for giving us this opportunity to be able to get the insight directly from a credible source such as yourself. We will continue to do this podcast and continue to reveal and correct the rhetoric on both immigration and public policy issues. And of course, the dangers that we face today are real. And I think people have to start waking up. And I think, the previous interview you provided gave a lot of insight to a lot of people. They're waking up. They're seeing things from a different perspective. And I certainly appreciate your time today. And I want to thank you for that.
Okay. Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate it.
You're
I'll
welcome.
be great.
In closing, we are now at the close. We will have this episode air later this week, but we want to thank our sponsors, and of course, thank Arturo for your continued commitment.